There, hold on. Just
Okay.
yeah, I see you in both windows, so
Okay.
I don't see myself at all.
Okay. Well, cool. So how are you?
I'm fine.
Good.
I guess, all things considered. Hold on just a second. Let me see here.
Sure.
Yeah, I see you in all the windows. I am not present in anything, at least to me. So, can you see me at all?
Yeah, I see you nice and big, and
There,
it's really
there,
nice.
there, there I am. Okay, finally, finally, whatever. You know, my understanding is there's so much crap going on the internet right now that it's really, really difficult for providers to keep up. In fact, all the YouTube videos that are being produced right now are being processed in standard definition. They've eliminated the high definition
Mhm.
because they need the bandwidth.
I believe it. I know. Well, Anthony's working from home, and oh, I started recording anyway. I think I have to tell you
Yes,
that in California.
yes, yeah. It's right there. Stephanie is recording the call, so I had said
But yeah, Anthony's been working from home, and I mean, he's been working at this place. He has like at least an hour commute each way every
right.
day. And with traffic, it can get to be, an hour and a half. But so he's been working there for, I don't know, over 5 years, and he keeps asking them or bringing up, working remotely. Oh, no, no, we can't do that. So now this happens. I think, we really got to do it. And I think it's been a little less smooth than it would have been otherwise because, there's a lot of things to smooth out and stuff. And then, like you say, with
Right.
everything's so internet dependent that things go slowly. So,
Yeah.
but
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm just having to, I have to I have to do my class this way now. So
mm,
we use Zoom, and then there's also an application in Blackboard called Collaborate that is
mm,
specifically for Blackboard, but
oh,
it allows remote classroom stuff. So that's what we've been doing.
yeah. So, how you feeling?
I am, despite everything, despite being furloughed, I actually, considering how things are transpiring here in New York,
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually pretty good. It's really difficult to describe to people that are not here just sort of what the vibe is. Even though I'm not in the city, um, I mean, I have friends that are in the city that either live there, that are in Queens or Brooklyn, live there, so are watching what's going on. Or I do have one friend who is a healthcare worker in Queens,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not even anything that can be described. It's like, she's been in war zones, and this is worse than a war zone in the sense that in war zones you expect certain types of things, and you're talking more traumatic injuries there, so you expect a kind of goriness, you know what I mean? But here it's like the patients are, um, well, they have to be isolated, um, and they're alone.
Mm-hmm.
They're completely isolated from their family and from loved ones. And so nurses and other healthcare professionals have to do stuff that emotionally they don't really do very much, or they don't have to because others do that. Chaplains do that, or so, and it's really. She said she goes home. She doesn't go home. That they have these um, all of the apartment and tenement buildings and hotels
Mm-hmm.
that are in the vicinity have been enlisted to provide shelter for people who can't, because they can't go home. They have, because they don't want to take it home to their families.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
and a lot of them commute to different parts of the city, usually. So she says she just goes home she goes to wherever she's living right now. She hasn't seen her family except by like this, for already 3 weeks. And she just goes home, and she goes back to her, where her shelter, and just cries.
The other thing about a war zone is that my brother's retired Air Force. He was involved in a lot of stuff in the Middle East the last while. Even living near an airport, you hear they are very well supplied most of the time, right? And these people are just having to, well, I guess I'll put on a plastic, hefty bag because we don't have any personal. And then, of course, there's a whole thing of, if someone is hit by shrapnel, it's horrible, but you can't catch it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's not contagious. It's not contagious. Yeah, it's and and it's starting to creep up into the valley. So, like this time last week, we had 4 cases in Ulster County. Now we have over 300. And of course, it's assumed that there's at least 10 times more cases than that, which means there's actually 3,000 cases. And I have people like my neighbors who, right next door to me, who they are not paying attention to any of this at all. And they have people come over that don't live there, crowds of people. They don't even bother to do the social distancing. They have an elderly mother and father that live over there. And I'm just like, it just makes, I'm not worried about catching anything from them because there's enough distance between houses, But I'm just like, you know what? Y'all could just get mowed down. And you just and you just don't like friggin' get it, you know what I mean? And if if an emergency vehicle shows up in the middle of in the front of your house one of these evenings, I'm going to be like, well, there you go.
The terrible that's the terrible thing that is, because I've been thinking a lot about this whole, because this is, how do I want to say, so when I was 15, I became very ill and almost died with some type of, probably an autoimmune lung disease. I've almost been killed by it a number of times since then. And I have been with the same doctor who's a pulmonologist, and for about 30 years, from the time I was very young. And so this was something that was always like a thing of, he'd always reassure me. I'm like, well, if this happens or that happens, he's like, yeah, we'll be able to take care of you, blah, blah, blah. But when I but every once in a while I'd bring up like a flu pandemic or something like that, and he'd just you could just see him just kind of lose a little bit of color. Because, and so this isn't shocking to me. I also had a friend when I was back in the 80s who really got into the 1918 flu pandemic for whatever reason. So I learned about that. My sister was always very interested in the Black Death. So all these scenarios, this kind of tends to play out this way every time. On a more personal note, I spent a lot of time living in Berkeley, and having to go to the main hospital there, Altabates. And I remember I was probably about 15 years ago, I was at the same doctor and I was very ill. I was taking screamingly high doses of prednisone. And he was like, okay, if after a week on this, you don't improve, we'll put you in the hospital and give you intravenous steroids. Okay. So the day came and I wasn't able to tell him how I was doing because I was hallucinating so absolutely completely. Sight, smell, sound, proprioception, everything. The only thing I knew was I was hallucinating because I kind of expected it from my medical situation. I'd been there before, and he was talking to me on the phone. I'm like, I don't know. So I came to see him, and he was just like, all he could say was, I don't have a bed for you. I don't know when I'll have a bed for you, because they were having a hard flu season. Mm-hmm. This wasn't the H1N1. This was a whole nother thing. But we already had this system that just gets overtaxed, because the main thing is everyone wants to make money out of it, right? Instead of thinking, well, how do we plan as a community to take care of our health needs? Anyway, so, but it's terrible to see. And so I always think about the spiritual, ethical, moral aspect of it, which is that, it's definitely tempting to think about, well, if those people are fucking around doing things that, they shouldn't do, if it hits them, too bad. But then you have people like Typhoid Mary, right? She was doing that, but she never got it, right? She was just spreading it to everyone else.
She was a super spreader, yeah.
Yeah. So it makes it difficult. And I've been thinking a lot about, because we're going to talk about some of the paranormal things that are happening around this and some of the theory about it. And I was reading George Hansen, my favorite. Trickster and The Paranormal. And I really like that book because he approaches the paranormal from the aspect of like sociology, anthropology, psychology, but these ideas of the paranormal arising in certain kind of social ecological conditions, and one of the and how these conditions tend to cluster around the trickster archetype of, you have like coyote. One I'd like to bring up right now who's especially applicable is Hermes, the trickster in Greek mythology, because he was the god of boundaries. And everything about this is all about boundaries, right? National boundaries. Who's going to be doing the boundaries? Who do we let in? Who do we not let in? Who do your neighbors let into their house? Who do you keep distant from? What is inside? What is outside, right? And these invisible things. This is an especially liminal, as far as being betwixt and between type of germ, because you have so many people who, they've been exposed. They have it, but they don't know it for several days. They can infect other people. And then also, after they have seemingly recuperated, when you would expect them to not be infectious anymore, guess what? They still are. So there's this whole kind of idea of the unconscious, or things that have been suppressed, or things that you can't see, really coming to the fore and playing a very big role in everything that's happening around us. So I think it would be very prime, according to his theories, which I think are pretty apt, to see a lot of premonitions, crisis apparitions, UFOs. I wanted to mention there is a group. I was speaking with Susan Demeter, and she, along with Greg Bishop, founded a group called The Paranormal and the Pandemic. I don't think that's the exact name. I'll link to it when I post this. She said to please mention this. We had been speaking about, talking about this. You sent me a message. I said, yeah. And then they started this group, I don't know, a few days or a week later, or something about the same topic. She posted in there about a situation, there's a couple of people that she knows through her husband. They're in Italy. And a mother and a son, I think they had been bereaved recently somehow, both had the feeling at night to go out and look up at the stars. Both of them saw anomalous lights. The son actually took a camera phone picture of them. But this is, fascinating, because you have like the telepathy between the two of them, the whole idea of, the death as a very liminal state, opening the door to these type of manifestations, the telepathic aspect of both of them to go witness this event, the whole idea of, spook lights and ghosts and the dead manifesting through these lights. So it's there's a lot of these type of incidents that have been coming up. I know that you have some from, I think, history and stuff too. So, but in that group, a lot of the people that have been posting have been talking about, a lot of people have had the situation of, this tends to be a case with empaths or people with thin boundaries, that you will have this kind of free-floating anxiety that comes up that you can't pin on anything. You feel very uncomfortable. Woman was talking about getting these kind of flashes of light that she and I think it's her husband would both see, even though there was nothing there. And then, so this started, I think, in January, when she ended up, when it got, or a little maybe before, when it finally hit the States and her area, boom, it evaporates. And a lot of other people were talking about getting like nightmares and stuff. And the same thing, when it kind of got close to them, then, and it's kind of like when you see this, something's over the horizon, creating this uneasiness, but then when you see it there, it kind of like collapses the waveform or something. And people find that it relieves a lot of the stress. They'll be sleeping better and stuff. I think sometimes maybe because I don't know why it is, but I've noticed that phenomenon myself a lot.
Oh yeah. I mean, one of the, I mean, as you know, I became quite ill in late January into February, and to this day they don't know exactly what I had. I it it at the time I went to the doctor, and I very rarely go to the doctor with anything. And I mean, I'm just not I'm not a doctor goer, and so I actually went to the doctor though, because I could tell that something was weird with this.
Mm-hmm.
And And subsequently, and he couldn't figure out what it was. I mean, they tested me for everything, and
Yeah.
I tested negative. And they finally, I think I told you, they finally diagnosed me with community spread pneumonia of unknown origin. That's literally what they said. And he had actually asked me if I had had any contact with anybody from China. So
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I didn't meet like the real tight rules that they
Yeah.
had at the time.
Criteria.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I had forgotten when I talked to him at that point. I had
Hmm.
forgotten that about 5 to 6 days previous, I had had a very strange encounter with a guy at a neighborhood grocery store who was clearly really, really ill.
Yeah.
And I had actually had uh, I had been coming around the corner into an aisle and
Hmm.
didn't see him, and he was so ill. He was like a nicely dressed elderly man, maybe in his 50s. And I'm in my 50s. I guess I'm
I know.
elderly. I'm
Same way.
elderly too.
No, I'm
I,
all the
I,
way there.
I think it's like I'm in my 50s and I'm elderly, right? But anyway, and he was so exactly, he was so sick that he actually was sort of flailing around in the aisle, and I didn't see him as I turned the aisle, and he ran right into me. I like had physical contact with him, and it freaked me out so much because he was coughing and just spewing everywhere that I immediately ran into the bathroom and tried to clean up, but I don't obviously think I cleaned up very well. And the only thing that was weird about it was that, now that we know sort of the progression of the disease, the symptoms, they were identical to all of those symptoms.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to go out and risk it,
Yeah.
but what was weird about that was that, I had that experience and then it just kind of went out of my mind. And about um, maybe 3 days after that, I had a really weird dream. And in this dream, I was I was in a car with my mother, and I say my mother in quotes because it wasn't really my mother here. My
Yeah.
mother and my stepmother. I do
Hmm.
have a stepmother who I've never been close to. And for some reason we were both like in the car together. We were doing some event. I mean, we had been doing something. And then my mother got out of the car and I was going to get out too. But then all of a sudden my stepmother, who I don't particularly care for,
Hmm.
she did something and
Uh-huh.
abducted me and drove away really quick. And the only reason she said she was going to do this, because I was like, what the hell are you doing? Because I didn't want my mom to be alone and walking alone through this huge parking lot to her car, although it was, whatever. I mean, it got all complicated. But the point, that the emotional content was being suddenly grabbed away by somebody that you don't really know or something that you don't really understand, and
Hmm.
being taken somewhere and I was trying to argue with this person, about what are you doing, and this person kept saying, oh, you're just arguing like your father. Which was hilarious, because my response to that was, well, what if I am? So what? uh, but
It
anyway.
stands to reason. Well, you know what's interesting about that dream, because the classic interpretation of a car is as your body, right?
Right,
Right.
right.
So this woman was keeping you in your body.
Well, it wasn't just that though. There was
Weird, huh?
there was an emotional component to it that was
Yes.
very, very troubling. And when I woke up, since I work with my dreams all the time, it wasn't a bad dream. It wasn't like a nightmare, but it had, I can't even explain this exactly, but it had a feeling of prescience.
Yeah.
Like there was something that it
Coming
that
towards you.
that I was being warned about something. I mean, but I couldn't figure out like what the hell would I be being warned about? And it was that morning when I woke up that my symptoms began. And I'm convinced now that I mean, I think that the dream meant lots of things, but I think part of it was a warning to myself that this illness was coming. And because the idea in the dream was that I was going to be taken away from my normal activities and that I was going to be forced, because this is what was happening in the dream, I was going to be forced to face certain things inside myself, and that I would and that I couldn't operate like usual. And that's what happened. And things have not been the same ever since. I mean, it's like, it took me 3 weeks to be able to basically return to work. By the time I returned to work, and I had already, by the time I got sick, I had already figured out, I'd been watching this
Yeah.
I'd been watching this in China, and I had gotten a really bad feeling about it. I was like, this is going to be something. I don't know how big of a something, but this is going to be of consequence. And so I started preparing externally, like I started squirreling money away.
Yeah.
I made sure, I actually made sure that because we purchase our toilet paper in bulk once a year from this manufacturer. I mean, we
Yeah,
do from
storage space.
and it's because we have I want to get, I insist that my toilet paper be recycled.
Yeah.
And because we have a septic system, it has to be single ply.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
really actually really hard to get single ply recycled paper that's completely. So there's like this one place where we have found it, but you have to buy it. They sell to institutions. They'll sell to people, but you have to buy like a huge bulk order. Well, we have enough. You buy one order and you have enough toilet paper for 18 months. But I had noticed that we were like maybe running a little bit low. So I told Alan, we need to buy some more. And he
Yeah.
did, and it was no big deal. So didn't have to worry about that. But I started preparing. By the time I got back to work, it was very clear that
What was that?
it was beginning to spread. And then 4 weeks after that, I get laid off.
Yeah.
So, or actually, yeah, 4 weeks off after that, I get laid off. So, but I kind of had a sense that something was coming. And I've talked to a lot of other people that have had weird dreams surrounding this and really odd. And even while I was sick, I had a couple of experiences. And I don't know if you pay any attention to CNN, but Chris Cuomo, he was being interviewed by, you know, Gupta, Dr.
Oh,
Gupta, whatever,
yeah.
Sanjay Gupta. And he actually had a weird experience. He had he calls it a hallucination,
Yeah.
but he had a visitation from his father who has passed, Chris Cuomo. When
Yeah.
he went overnight, he had this weird experience that he was describing where all of his sudden his father appeared before him. And
Yeah.
he's attributing it to fever, but I don't know. I
Sometimes
don't
these
know.
physical, how do I want to say, uh, certain physical conditions, right, can facilitate this type of connection between the two worlds, right? It's like if you're going to go on a vision quest, right? You're not eating, you're not drinking much, you're depriving yourself of sleep in order to kind of loosen the bounds, loosen your attention to the physical, right? So that you can access these attentional realms. So sometimes I think if someone, let's say on the other side, someone who's already passed is trying to get your attention, they have to wait until you're in some different type of headspace before they can be like, because normally we're so distracted by all the mundane that, it could be very hard for them to get our attention, I think. But that's very interesting. I wanted to bring up Great Dream, which is nice because I guess it has like time-step electronic documentation that it was back in October. I listened to a podcast called Weird Studies. It's J.F. Martell and Phil Ford. They were corresponding, and also on their Patreon. Phil Ford had this dream in October. You can go and listen to it. I think it's episode 68. It's like on dreams in the underworld. They open with it. So if you don't want to listen to the whole show, you can just hear this in the beginning. he's standing in the doorway looking into like a typical suburban dining room, and there is this kind of intelligent entity hanging above the dining room, this weird object. And he describes it in his writing at the time. He says it looks like an electron microscope view of a virus.
Yeah, right.
And it starts growing these tendrils, and then he says I don't even have words for what it did, but it was like it started to deliquesce, and just its its intelligence started to invade everything and invade the entire world and just change the entire world into its. It sounded like a very freaky, weird dream, but and this was back in October.
Right.
So
Well, what's interesting, what you saying that is, see, I many years ago, I guess, yeah, it's been many years ago. Whenever I would get ill, I would do research on whatever I was ill with. This is what I do. I would do research on whatever I was ill with, and then I would go into meditation and I would attempt to contact its consciousness.
Of course.
Just to kind of figure out, what do you want? What is this about? And I would find out all kinds of things about, like, why I got sick, or like why all of us were getting sick at a particular time. I did this with Lyme, the Lyme pathogen. And what's interesting is that, I mean, this is one of the more interesting experiences that I've had. I got in touch with the Lyme pathogen when I had Lyme. And I had to wait till I was recovering from it a little bit, because my actual illness was so terrible that I really couldn't think until I got it. I got it under control. But the experience I had with it was that particular pathogen, there was like an anger and a violence in it. And then, of course, I find out this year that there are many people who believe that the Lyme pathogen, the way that it currently is in our environment, was what was a weaponized version of a naturally occurring pathogen. There's actually been a book that's been written about this from a well-attested source. I mean, the guy whose name, Wally Bergdorf, that the spirochete itself is named after, he himself believes that this pathogen is a pathogen that he worked on, because that's what he did for the military for many years. So what I did with this coronavirus was I did the same thing. I mean, I just sort of tried to get in contact with it. And I got a completely different vibe. Regardless of how terrible this thing is for us, this virus is having a great time. Yeah, seriously, it's like, whoa! It's like a new virus, and it's like, whoa! Look at all of this space. Look at all of these creatures to colonize. What? It's enjoying itself.
Well, that's interesting because of all the people that it's like they get so nervous and have all this stuff before it's getting here, but once it's kind of near them, they're kind of like, maybe they're picking up on that vibe, almost more relaxing. Right. I had a similar experience with influenza virus one year, and it's a very different type of consciousness. Like you say, is very expanded, and it has like a lot of room to roam, and lots of it's wild. So what else did you pick up on?
Well, what that reminded me of, I mean, when I had that experience, is it reminded me of a couple things. The first thing it reminded me of is, and I know that I study this stuff, was the Seth material, because in the Seth material, in the individual and nature of mass events, Seth talks very specifically about pathogens, about those organisms, or they're not really organisms, but those bits of consciousness that cause disease. And the way Seth describes it is, from our perspective, because of who we are and how we're affected by it, by our perspective, these things are terrible. He said, but from the perspective of the consciousness that is being expressed as this whatever it is, a virus or a bacteria or whatever. He said it's actually kind of an experiment. This because what's usually happening is that, and this is how he describes it. What's usually happening is that you have some kind of consciousness that is expressing some facet of life on Earth, and it needs to make itself known. And so what it does is it finds a way of sending that message in a package that will make a maximum impact.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes it as being a component of the planet. That this is one of the ways in which planetary consciousness expresses itself, to itself and to the other parts of itself, of which we are, of course, part of that. And he does say, when these kinds of things happen, pay attention to your dreams, pay attention to the patterns, the larger patterns. So when I look at the patterns of the virus, one of the things that I notice, and I'm sure other people have noticed this too. And if I've been recommending that you pay attention to Dr. John Campbell on YouTube, because not number one, he's hilarious, but number two, he's just this great, guy from the UK, giving you the daily rundown of this.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things he's been really good about doing is he's been really good about looking at the individual variations in different nations and different populations mm-hmm. of how this is impacting them. And it isn't impacting everybody the same. And it's not exactly because of what precautions they have or have not been taking. That's part of it, but it isn't all of it. And there are, there are what we call incommensurables. In other words, there are unexplained mm-hmm. aspects to this that like, for example, there's Sweden and Norway. Mm-hmm. Now, Norway has been a little bit more careful than Sweden, but Sweden has had, they're pretty close to each other. But for some reason, Sweden they've actually been reacting very similarly. But for some reason, Sweden has a lot more cases than Norway does. Mm-hmm. And it's really not clear why.
Yeah.
So there are different ways. I'm going to sneeze now.
Okay.
Excuse me. It's allergies. There are different ways in which this is impacting different groups of people. Mm-hmm. And the way Seth describes it too is that whenever you have a mass event like this, because whether it's a natural disaster or a war, I would call this a kind of natural disaster, or a pandemic. And he does talk quite a bit about epidemics specifically in pandemics. Mm-hmm. Says what's happening is that everyone in the world that's affected by it has decided to kind of participate in this at some level. Mm-hmm. Now, kind of as a group, but there are some groups that will participate with it more, and then there are some individuals who will participate in it. So every single person has their own kind of relationship with this, as mm-hmm. well as the sort of larger relationships that we all have. So he says, pay attention to your dreams, pay attention to your impulses, pay attention to patterns, larger patterns that are occurring with people. All of those, pay attention to the meaningful coincidences. Uh-huh. Because those will give you clues as to, what kind of message is being portrayed or being expressed by this. And I think that it is about boundaries. It's also about the transgression of certain boundaries.
Oh yeah. Yep.
And
have boundaries and transgressions of boundaries go hand in hand.
Yeah. And to me, it's, the fact that, I think my favorite meme about all of this on Facebook has been, I can't remember it exactly. It was like a tweet, but somebody had written, humans. Oh, we can't shut down the world economy in order to help climate change, in order to do that. And then underneath it had the earth. Here's a virus. Practice. You know,
it's one of the most fascinating things to me, because a lot of it has to do with, as here, you know, we're here in the United States of America, you and I, and it's big on the whole idea of individual potential, individual liberty, the actions of individuals creating all this stuff, which is something that can definitely happen. As well, you know, what we do collectively is very important. And I had been wondering for quite a while, ever since 2008, when we had that big collapse, and things are just getting worse and worse with more and more homeless
right.
and all this horrible stuff happening. I'm like, thinking, what will it take to shake things up? Because you just, as citizens, as average citizens, your ability to participate meaningfully in the political process has just been squashed and squashed, as they're, you know, repressing the vote and letting in big money, all this stuff. So it's interesting when these things come up. When you're talking about synchronicities, meaningful coincidences and stuff, and paying attention, I wanted to talk about, again, paying attention to the stuff around you. I had a boyfriend when I was younger, believe it or not. His father was this incredible man, Lloyd, and he was very much into divination. He threw the I Ching, he did tarot. He was always recording all his dreams. He was very into it. But what most struck me about him was his philosophy was that these are all just tools to develop your intuition, so that at a certain, your attention and discernment. So at a certain point, you don't need any of it. You can just look at the world around you and kind of see what's happening.
Right.
I have a friend who is an EMT. He has been very ill. Luckily, he is doing well now, with something that looked like probably was COVID, but he's in a situation where the medical system is being overwhelmed. So he's not, I don't think, getting great information on what happened with him. But he was letting me know that I don't know, in January, he says, looking back, that he didn't realize it, but in January, he started to see all type of references to 1917 through 1920, which of course is the time of the last great, you know, pandemic of influenza that we had. I, as you know, very interested in synchronicities. I had a couple of really big synchronicity clusters around May, and then again in October. They both had to do with these huge, vast, I don't want to say events, large scale regional events. The one in October had to do with, I live in the Napa Valley. We've been having these firestorms, and then in the beginning of October, they were going to have very similar conditions. So they cut the power to 3 million people in the greater North Bay, in the greater Bay Area, for a few days, and it was pretty windy. It was wild, and so they wanted to avoid any of these, you know, horrendous firestorms that we've been having. It worked pretty well, but the weird thing was, I had been called out a little before by my name by a podcaster talking about like I was named after a sugar heiress, the speckled sugar heiress. And so there was like this kind of like idea of like me and, you know, the sugar. So anyway, we go to have this big power shut off, and it was a huge area. I would have had to drive at least an hour in one direction with no traffic to get anywhere where they had power on. I mean, it was like a huge area, and I could have driven a couple hours, you know, the other way, and not run into any place that had power. Anyway, so what happened was that there is a bridge called the Carquinez Bridge, and it goes over part of the delta of the San Francisco Bay. It's like this huge, deep, very cold tidal water. So it's not like some little tiny weeny marshy thing. It's like big, bad, cold waters, right? And I guess what happened was something caught fire at one end of this bridge, and these winds are so strong, they're like gusts of up to 100 miles an hour or more. It just blew this fire for over this cold water for like over half a mile or so into the town of Crockett. Now, Crockett is interesting to me because I have a good friend that I live next door to, and her son were living there. So I was like really petrified. They ended up having to evacuate with nothing. Luckily, they were fine. They put out the fire. They didn't lose any of their stuff. So that was scary. And then my both my brother coming from the north and then my dad and his wife coming from the south were at that bridge when this fire blew up, and both had to turn around and go back home and stay in home, right? So it was kind of pre-shadowing some of this, the big societal disruption, the danger to your family and loved ones, the whole idea that you have to be separated from each other, right? You have to go home and stay home. But the thing that tied it back to this previous synchronicity was that Crockett is very famous for the CNH sugar factory, right? And they have this great neon sign out there. It says CNH sugar. It's very famous, and you can see it from this bridge, the Carquinez Bridge that blew up. And it's interesting because it's the California and Hawaiian sugar factory. The lady I was named after, my mom left California, went over to Hawaii where she met this lady, the sugar heiress, and they came back. So it's like this weird kind of like meshing of all this stuff, but it's very much about, danger, not being able to cross, all this thing. But earlier, I had another kind of premonitions having to do with like seeing this bright pink color everywhere. Ended up with my mom in the hospital with a clot. And a lot of weird stuff around Lyme disease. Now, clots to me always mean Lyme disease because I got Lyme disease. And because of the treatment, I ended up getting clots and pulmonary embolisms, right? And again, I was, oh yeah, that's fun. And they took over a month to find them, so it was very bad. But the thing was, again, it's like all my family's in danger because, right, they're going to have this clotting risk as well. And since that time, my mom came up with these clots and stuff. But there was all this kind of like weird, kind of strange stuff about Lyme, which is weird because Lyme is also something that has emerged from the animal kingdom and is infecting us. It's a newly emergent. It's looking like it has to do with changes in ecology as well. And like you're saying, both the COVID-19 and Lyme seem to have merged in areas where they have big laboratories that are studying these type of diseases, and both have had these allegations and speculations. I think it's more than speculation in the instance of Lyme, but that they were created as bioweapons. So it was weird because I was thinking, why the Lyme stuff? But then, when we started to see what was happening with the COVID-19, it started to kind of come out. So, I think this is another thing with boundaries where you start to have, people are having dreams and remembering them. You're having stuff showing up in the real world. It was very, I don't know, I wrote it up on my blog to try and convey what it's like when you're thinking about, because I've been trying to precipitate synchronicities all last year. I was thinking, I want to get some good ones with some good documentation that it doesn't, because sometimes you get really good ones, but it's always like, oh, it's my mom's birthday and my sister's birthday and my brother's birthday and all their identifying information and where our street address. So, you don't necessarily want to be putting all this all over for everyone to steal your identity. So I've been thinking about doing that, but it's a really creepy feeling with then, I had the whole thing with my neighbor and I felt terrible with the bridge. And then, my brother and then my dad and a bonus mom say, oh yeah, actually we were at that fire too. It's like a creepy feeling when you feel like your subconscious stuff is like coming out there. But on a worldwide level, it's like all the stuff that we've been trying to say, oh, just as long as the stock market is fine, everything's good. It doesn't matter if we have scads of homeless people everywhere. It doesn't matter if people don't make a living wage. All these things that we've been trying to tamp down. It's like, well, we know that there's these pandemics and we've seen emerging diseases. I mean, you were around for AIDS, right? I was around for AIDS. It's but we kind of blow it off and say, well, it doesn't matter. The market will take care of it. It's like, well, no, we should have been paying attention, but we weren't.
Right. So. Well, and I was thinking about this a lot because one of the things that in order to prepare for our talk tonight, because I'm a historian, I went back and I specifically looked, I mean, you can go through all kinds of different examples, but I specifically looked at three large disasters in the United States, one of which I don't know that a lot of people even know about. And that is the great smallpox pandemic that occurred in in the newly emergent United States in 1776 to 1777, and
Yes.
and that actually, not only did it affect the early outcome of the Revolutionary War, but um, there were a lot of really weird things that attended that,
Hmm.
that you have to go kind of back to the historical record to sort of figure out. And of course, and one of the other things, and this is a more personal thing for me, is the Civil War, which a
Hmm.
lot of people don't recognize. I mean, it's not a natural disaster, but it was a very specific and important historical moment for the United States. And there is a book I would recommend even to you,
Hmm.
and it is called. I have never found a book like this. It is called Midnight in America:
Hmm.
Darkness, Sleep, and Dreams During the Civil War.
That sounds
And
awesome.
and it has what it does is it's plumbed the literature.
Hmm.
And because what this historian figured out is that what really distinguishes the common literature of the Civil War is how much dream material
Isn't it?
is preserved in it, and how much and how many weird paranormal experiences are recorded. He's not actually a paranormal guy, but he noticed that there were so many paranormal experiences that were recorded that were connected to dreams and visions and other
Hmm.
things, that he came to the conclusion that something had to have been going on. It's not that everybody's premonition came true. I mean, that's always true. It's not that everybody's premonition came true, but there were just so many of them that were so well preserved that he said it's really without parallel. And he recommends people to actually look at this literature. But what he's done is sort of a summary of it, and he looks at soldiers and their
Hmm.
dreams. He looks at civilians and their dreams, African American dreams, which is really important to me, dreams of the dying, experiences of the dying, how these
Hmm.
things were then recorded in popular culture, and then looking at Lincoln,
Yep.
because
Classic.
Lincoln clearly had a lot of these experiences as well as seeing his own death. I mean, he had a dream that was very specific about his own
Yes.
death, and then looking at how all of these experiences influenced the explosive growth of post Civil War spiritualism in the United States.
Yes, that's what I was going to
and
say.
and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and because but anyway, he records so many things. And the reason this is important to me, and the reason this is important to me, is that my family has, on my mother's side, has a very curious connection to the
Hmm.
Civil War. And it's through one of my maternal ancestors. I had a maternal ancestor, direct maternal ancestor. However many grandpas it goes back, and he actually participated in several campaigns in the Civil
Hmm.
War. He survived. He was in a prisoner of war camp for a little while,
Oh
and then
boy.
he escaped. He actually escaped, and he was wounded twice. And one
Jeez.
of the times when he was wounded was down in he spent time in an encampment, a temporary Union hospital encampment in the area that is now Cassville, Missouri. Okay.
Hmm.
So this was sort of at that time, that was sort of at one of the far western arenas. And then he got moved to the east, and he participated in the ending part, the last part of the Battle of Chattanooga, which was this huge campaign that set up Sherman's march to Atlanta. And he was actually in this very specific skirmish called the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And it was while he was there. The reason we
Hmm.
know this is
Hmm.
because he kept a diary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and he so, and while he was at Missionary Ridge, he was wounded again, and then he contracted dysentery. Which, of course, when you got dysentery, they couldn't treat it at the time. The only thing they could treat it with was with opiates to control the diarrhea, because
Yeah.
we didn't have antibiotics or anything like that to get it to stop. So he basically, once he survived, but he basically was considered to be disabled for the rest of his life because of that, because it comes and goes, for the rest of your life. But what's interesting is that we have very specific information about where he was at different times.
Yeah.
Now, here's where the synchronicity comes in. My brother, who is a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
he opened an urgent care emergency clinic
Mm-hmm.
in Cassville, Missouri, where his ancestor had been hospitalized.
Yeah,
And
that's
he
pretty. Yeah.
and he opened. It turned out that his opening day was the day that, the same date that my ancestor was mustered into that hospital. So that's the first weird thing. The second weird thing is that my mother, who obviously is my brother's mother too. My mother, she had a job. Um, she became the director, and this was many years ago. She became a director of one of the first United Way, and this was like in the late '60s. It was the middle '60s. One of the first United Way centers, and this is before they had legislation providing for federal dollars and state dollars to help disabled people, or
Yeah. Yeah.
help children with like Down syndrome and autism and things like that. But she
Mm-hmm.
became there was like a center, a center that was opened up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or my family lived there at
Mm-hmm.
the time. And they had a center. Their main center was up on Missionary Ridge, that same ridge where my
Oh,
where,
that's
where
crazy.
and she
Mm-hmm.
became the day that she became the director was the day that the date that the Battle of the Missionary Ridge began. Now she's the one who figured this out, because she is a Civil War,
Buff.
she buff, huge
Yeah.
buff.
Uh-huh.
She like has to go. She's had it's her goal. It's been her goal to go to every single major battlefield like in the country, and she's made it to most of them.
Yeah.
But when she's the one who figured that date out, and she was just
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, that is so weird. And then later on, it was several years later, it was many years later, obviously. It was like in the I guess it would be in the 90s, when my brother set up his practice in Cassville. And I just thought to myself, that is the strangest thing ever. The two places that ancestor was are two places where my family, direct lineal descendants of that person, had major events in their life on the
No,
same date that
it's the power of the ancestors, and it's the power of history. And I think when you were talking about the differences between how this COVID virus is affecting different groups, a lot of it does have to do with history. I mean, one of the reasons why it will be affecting even just on the groups that are more vulnerable or less vulnerable, if you have had in your own past a historical exposure to something close to it, or your ancestors have particular genes that you managed to snag that help you to survive this, you're going to have a different reaction than someone who hasn't had that similar history or genetic ancestry. So, and the same with various areas, if they've had the history of pandemics more alive, kept more alive, and be able to prepare more, they're going to have a different response and hopefully a different outcome. So all these facts, I mean, it goes to the power of the past. And I think that, first of all, that's just a great synchronicity right there. I love it, because I love dates and places like that, because it makes it
yeah.
real, it anchors it, and it makes it easy. And you have the whole family aspect of it. It makes it very easy for people to see the connections. So it's nice, because sometimes, I don't want to say, I'm more mystically inclined, and I've been looking at the world from the imaginal perspective for many decades, and I've had people train me up in that. so it can be difficult to convey these things to other people, the kind of numinous, symbolic aspects of it. Sometimes, if people are a little more rationally based, materialistic, they'll still be able to grasp something like that because the identifiers are very clear and they're not oblique.
Right.
As they can be in other more, powerful synchronicities too and stuff. So.
Well, what's interesting to me is that this involves my mother and my brother. It doesn't involve me, So I don't have a synchronicity here with this, except that I'm
Yet.
related to them. Well, who
Yet.
knows? Who knows? I mean,
Uh-huh.
I don't have the same kind of, my connection to my ancestors is more through my, because this part of the family is actually connected to my mother's side,
Mhm.
and I have more of a connection to my mother's father's side, and more of a connection, I think, to certain aspects of my father's side.
Mhm.
But it's I mean, in terms of my mother's side, the one really interesting synchronicity that I share with my mother and my grandmother, her mother,
Mhm.
and this is one of those weird. I mean, I don't know how much you believe in astrology, but
Mhm.
my mother is a Cancer, I am a Leo, and her mother was a Virgo. Okay,
Mhm.
but all
Mhm.
three of us had Capricorn rising and Taurus moon to the same degree.
That's pretty wild. That's pretty
That
fun.
that's pretty bizarre. It's like when I figured that out, I was like, now that's karma. I have no idea what it means, except that we're all crabby. But
Well, I have a Cancer moon. I'm Taurus. My brother is Leo, and yeah, I'm one of those people that tends to. Well, like a Cancer hides things. So if you have a Cancer moon, it's like even deeper down.
there's a paranoia there. A little bit of a paranoia, right? Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, my partner has 4 planets in Cancer, including his sun and his moon. So, so he's got more than one paranoid bone. He is much more paranoid than I am. I mean, I have to be convinced of paranoia because it's not that I don't think there are conspiracies. I mean, I do think that there are conspiracies, but I don't personally think that I'm important enough to have a conspiracy about. So,
Yeah.
so I have, hold on, I have to deal with the cat just a
Yeah.
minute. Go away, cat. Go away, go away, go away, go away. So I have to, so I tend to not quite buy that conspiracies have anything to do with me.
Uh-huh.
I don't, I just don't. I have a Capricorn rising. I'm like, who cares? Or bring it on. Screw
Hmm.
you, who
That's
cares?
funny.
Which, by the way, I don't know why, but I just saw your cover picture, your cover Facebook picture of the
Oh,
angel flipping. That is hilarious. That's
I,
like, that's like really hilarious. I might have to steal that for something. That's really
there was
funny.
a little GIF going around on Valentine's Day, and it just busted me up. So I had to put that up there. It just cracked me up. But so I wanted to go back to you talking about abduction, being
Oh,
abducted, right?
oh,
A,
you, oh,
a
you mean my dream
your
being
dream, right? It's how do I want to say, a magically powerful, so shall we say, a woman being abducted by an enemy to a certain extent, right?
my stepmom.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about another book that I'm always recommending to everyone for the last 10 plus years, and I don't think anyone's ever read it, but I'm going to recommend it again. Paula Gunn Allen's book,
Oh
Pocahontas.
no, that's a great book.
Isn't it
I,
fantastic?
I like
But
her
one,
anyway. I like her
I
anyway.
love her so much. This is
Yeah.
one of my favorite books. But one of the things that she talks about, and is very similar, but it's from an oral tradition, indigenous perspective. One of the things that she talks about is that there are these certain kind of constellations that happen. You may call them mythical, but they mean that something's up. In this case, with Lady Rebecca here, that was at the time that the New World was being opened up to Europeans, and there were starting to be conflict and consequences, including many horrible pandemics, smallpox being a big one. Which,
Measles.
yeah, all type
Measles.
of horrible diseases. But what she talks about is that there's a lot of myths that reflect what was going on at the time. And one of the things is, I know this is something you're interested in, is that Lady Rebecca, or she was at that time Pocahontas, was abducted by aliens, taken off to a hostile area, right? In an alien craft, this kind of high technology, and ended up being married to one of these alien people, and had hybrid children, and also produced hybrid tobacco, which is a plant that helps you connect to the spirit world, right? She talks about how this reflects for a lot of native narratives where you have a very powerful, magically woman who is abducted or taken hostage by alien or enemy tribe, and then this causes all type of things to happen that, and at the end of it you have an entirely new world. She calls it like a world-changing time, world-changing ceremony, which she definitely lived in. But she talks that, you know, this happens in like Greek myths, like Helen of Troy, right? Psyche, right? Real super hot woman, you know, gets abducted. Suddenly the whole relationship between humans and the gods has to change because there's this huge tension with this situation. But she also talks about how there's a couple other, you know, Sacagawea and Milanini, the lady in who was enslaved by the Aztecs and threw in with Cortez.
Which by the way, it's Sacagawea.
Thank you. I knew I
It's,
was going to mispronounce it.
no, you pronounce it the way most people do. It's Sacagawea. That's okay. It's all right.
But so all of these women have these similar situations of going on, but it also reflects a lot of the alien abduction scenarios that you have these days, you know, that have been happening for the last while. You know, it's very similar to you because they also have, you know, a sexual and a magical element, and they are very big on hybrid children, right? Like Psyche had a, you know, they had their hybrid child with old Cupid there. So
Yeah, well, that's what I talk. That's actually a big component of what I talk about in my dissertation, and I'm not the only person who's noticed that. I
yeah.
could talk about it from a slightly different perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and because I look at how Indian captivity
Mm-hmm.
narratives, which of course are a formative narrative of early American literature, that do reflect occasional real practices that natives
Mm-hmm.
did, but the relationship between those Indian captivity narratives in the
Mm-hmm.
18th and 19th century, and then what later would emerge as alien abduction narratives, and the similarities between them and actually in very specific details. Sometimes I mean, all abduction narratives are going to be similar in some ways, but
Mm-hmm.
for example, the thing that I thought was most telling or interesting about those is not just simply the hybrid children, but
Mm-hmm.
in the Indian captivity narratives, because the reason why Indians were capturing white people anyway was this was one of the ways in which many native groups tried to replenish their own ranks, after war or after an epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do is you would go to whoever the victorious group was, and you would steal some of their people, especially their women and children, and you would literally adopt them into your group. And it was a it
Mm-hmm.
was a process of adoption, and
Yeah.
sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Although, interestingly enough, what we do know is that in many, many cases, women who were abducted by natives didn't really want to go back
I wonder
because
why.
their situation was actually a lot better. But
You think,
one
yeah.
of one of if they one of the features by which many native groups especially Algonquin native groups, would signal that this person had become a member of their tribe or their nation, was that they would tattoo them. They would mark them.
Exactly.
They
Yep.
would mark them. And of course, being marked is a very important component of the alien abduction narrative. You're marked in different ways. And I thought that was just really weird, because the truth is that we know that this really happened in the case of many Indian captivities. And we also know that many alien abductees really do have these weird scars. So you have to, so, you're just like, whoa, that's
Well,
really odd.
but it's not odd though, because ideas and the imaginal, emotional, mythic realm is a
Already,
real realm,
it
right?
is yes, it is a real.
And so when you have these big events, like these big world-changing events, things are really hopping. You'll have these ideas and these symbols, these constellations, these themes coming out, sometimes very specific details, all over the place, right? You're going to have a dream about being abducted. There's going to be real people being abducted, myths about abducted people. I've noticed that the myth of Persephone, who was a big abductee, has gained a lot of currency recently. There's a lot of people writing fan fiction about her and Hades, and they have like this great power couple. I don't know. I haven't read into it that deeply, but I've seen it a lot of areas. Um, so when these things kind of start busting out all over the place in all these various realms, I think a lot of people they want to denigrate things that are just until it actually happens flatly in the real world, right?
Well, in
But
front of
then,
in front of them,
yeah, exactly.
in front of them.
But I think that it can be a little foolish, because it's like if you're waiting until you're sick with COVID to do anything about it, to isolate yourself, right? You're going to infect all these other people when you think that you're perfectly fine, because you're not paying attention to what's happening below the surface. It's weird, because recently I realized from watching Hellier, of all things, they have a lot of names that the season 2, they have a lot of names that they get. They were talking about a lot about Al Crowley, Jack Parsons, and then the name Christensen was coming up a lot, which got me thinking, because I'm the type of person, all the experiences that you would have really expected me to have seen a UFO at a young age and had some type of alien abduction event or missing time thing happen, right? But I've never had anything like that. I've never seen a light I can't identify, nothing like that. However, I was thinking about that when they were mentioning those names in Hellier, because I grew up in Castro Valley, and I would walk down Parsons Avenue past Christensen Lane, where I used to walk to go to school. I walked down Parsons Avenue, and I would hit to go to Al's Market all the time. I had several abduction attempts when I was walking around as a little girl. One of them was right there in the Al's Market. They followed me to Al's Market, and I ran inside there. But I was thinking, so that's the type of thing I'm talking about, where
So not alien abductions, but just bad human abductions.
yeah, really scary, bad.
Bad human abductions, right?
Yeah, yeah. It was a weird time in the Bay Area. There was something like like about 20 or 30 years from the time I was small till the 2000. There was like something like 250 children went missing or were murdered in the Bay Area.
Oh my God.
So yeah, there were definitely people on the hunt. J.C. Lee Dugard got abducted and then kept in captivity in Antioch in the Bay Area. Yeah, so there was some bad stuff happening, but so I'd like to try and convey that if we have people that aren't super interested with that idea watching this, that Paula Gunn Allen talks about the implicate and explicate orders. The explicate is all the stuff that everyone can see, all your tables and chairs and books and stuff that's on the news or whatever. But the implicate order is like all the stuff. Thank you. Exactly.
The cup.
Yep. Behind that, all the processes that are happening that are generating all this that you can't see yet is the implicate order.
Okay, let me read you something.
Okay.
This is from Seth.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of personal, the individual, and the nature of mass events.
Mm-hmm.
It's the mechanics of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Your world and everything in it exists first in the imagination. Then You have been taught to focus all of your attention upon physical events so that they carry the authenticity of reality for you. Thoughts, feelings, or beliefs appear to be secondary, subjective, or somehow not real, and they seem to rise in response to an already established field of physical data. You usually think, for example, that your feelings about a given event are primarily reactions to the event itself. It seldom occurs to you that the feelings themselves might be primary, and that the particular event was somehow a response to your emotions rather than the other way around. The all-important matter of your focus is largely responsible for your interpretation of an event. For an exercise, then, imagine for a while that the subjective world of your thoughts, feelings, inner images, and fantasies represent the rock-bed reality from which individual physical events emerge. Look at the world for a change from the inside out, so to speak. Imagine that physical experience is somehow the materialization of your own subjective reality. Forget what you have learned about reactions and stimuli. Ignore for a time everything you have believed and see your thoughts as the real events. Try to view normal physical occurrences as the concrete physical reactions in space and time to your own feelings and beliefs, for indeed your subjective world causes your physical experience. That's exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things. And so I would caution people to not denigrate the realm of myth and the imaginal and ideas. I always like to think, even the people that are it's kind of funny. The people that I know that are the most materialistic spend so much time thinking about things in their head prior to doing them.
Exactly. I completely agree. And I mean, to me, it's like, oh, what was I going to say? It was like right on the, I'll find it again. But it was, to me, it's like, to me, physical reality and I guess what he calls subjective reality or internal reality, to me, they're really actually just they're on a continuum. They're continuations of each other. And there's this sort of, I call it the false membrane. There's sort of this weird place where we think that they divide. And I don't really think they divide that neatly, actually, at all. At least in my experience, they don't divide that neatly. And the proof to me was when I was at the height of my illness. When I was at the height of my illness, I awakened in the middle of the night. I sat up straight in bed. I had actually been sleeping, which was weird because I had had trouble sleeping, but somehow I had fallen asleep, and I sat up straight in bed. And this is what I remember. The only light in my room was the light on a vaporizer. I mean, objectively, that was the only light in my room. But when I woke up, I saw light in the room, and there was a presence in the room. And the presence was the same being, the same energy that had abducted me. And it said, and I said this, actually, I was completely awake and this was happening. And I said to it, I was completely unafraid. And I said, "What do you want?"
Yeah.
Because I never liked being awakened by anything in the middle of the night. I always tell spirits, if you're gonna deal with me, do it when I'm awake or do it in a dream, but don't wake me up. That pisses me off, So I'm always kind of aggressive when that happens, So I was like, "What do you want?" And it started telling me things, and it explained to me that if I wanted to change the course of my illness, I had to look inside and do certain things. And so it gave me these exercises, and I started doing these exercises. They were kind of spiritual exercises, really. And I started doing them. And as long as I followed its instruction, I started getting better. But whenever I'd get distracted, which, I had symptoms, I was coughing and stuff. And I have other thought patterns too, like especially fear. Whenever the fear would come, I would get pulled in a different direction and my symptoms would get worse. I mean, I know this sounds really bizarre, but
it does not to me. I've had every time I've come back from a bad illness, I've had that same exact experience.
But it was like I finally I finally, there were things inside of myself that I needed to resolve. And so finally I resolved enough that I was able to let go and go back to sleep. And when I woke up the next morning, I still needed to go to the doctor and get some other stuff, but it had changed.
Yes.
The illness had changed, and I somehow knew I would get better. And I can't even explain that. That's just, I mean, I've had other things like that, but not anything quite that dramatic. And now I think, I don't know whether it was my body talking to me or the virus talking to me. I don't know which it was actually, but it was definitely, you know, one of those kinds of experiences that you know, shamans talk about, and you know that you know, certainly, you know, a lot of people talk about having a serious illness and having sort of a visionary experience that comes out of it. You know, Black Elk talks about that. He had this terrible fever that he got, and he was like unconscious for, I guess, like 9 days or something. I mean, literally unconscious.
Yeah.
And while he was unconscious, he went on this journey, and that was when he had the vision of all of the interlocking hoops of all of humanity, and how, in order for humanity to survive on the planet, we needed to all bring all of our hoops together, you know, essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that, you know, obviously I think he's right. And I think that I think that these kinds of experiences, especially in disasters, I think these kinds of experiences are very, very they're oh, I know what I was going to say. I remember I was having a discussion similar to this to someone, and they were being skeptical. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, listen, if we assume that the planet is a conscious entity, or that there is
Mm-hmm.
a consciousness in the planet, how the hell else is it going to talk to us? Except through like dreams and having these experiences and viruses. I mean, like seriously, you know, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're not having our own separate visionary experiences. I mean, we are having things that are unique to each one of us, but we're also connecting with the larger consciousness of the planet,
Yes.
you know, and I find it really interesting that all of our ancestors had no problem understanding that at all. But for some reason, we get into this kind of locked in thing that's a really weird idea,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, that's a whole nother discussion. I'm looking at the time, and I was like you. I was very ill this last winter too, and I still am having some. I still keep having these low grade fevers and stuff. But I wanted to say I've had every time that I have come out of a major illness, I've had an intense visionary experience like you did. I mean, the near death experience was a big one, but yeah, I think it's a classic mystical kind of shamanic crisis or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, yeah, I think a lot more people have those type of experiences than maybe want to talk about it. But I'm glad that you shared yours, partly because I have been. I'm always very happy to hear from various people about their various strange or paranormal experiences. I get a lot of people that are very uptight about because they feel like a freak or whatever, and they really appreciate when people, you know, just speak frankly about these type of experiences. I think it's very helpful. I know I've heard from different people, so thank you. I don't know, is there anything you'd like to wrap up with, or because we'll have
Uh,
to talk again soon?
oh yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing that I did was, there were a couple of other things I wanted to just mention. I told you that one of the things I was going to look up during
Mhm.
this, you know, for this talk, was some other native stuff, and there are actually, I mean, many people know the about, you know, like the Hopi prophecies
Yeah, yeah.
of encountering white folks,
Mhm.
and certainly the Algonquin peoples of the Great Lakes in the Northeast have a tradition that's called the Seven Fires prophecy
Mhm.
tradition, in which operates in a similar kind of way. But one of the more interesting traditions that I, you know, was unaware of for a while is that the Aztecs had there were a series of really interesting visionary experiences that people had prior, that are recorded, you know, orally, and then were written down. Most of the stuff is in Spanish.
Mhm.
Um, but prior to Cortez showing up, and of course a lot of
I've heard of
people,
that. Yeah.
a lot of people, have heard the rumor about them mistaking Cortez for Quetzalcoatl, although actually some people now believe that Cortez made that up in order to make himself look better. But there is actually a well-attested sort of group experience, paranormal experience, that many people in Tenochtitlan, the great
Yeah.
city of the Aztecs, experienced on the night immediately prior to Tenochtitlan's fall. And this fall, of course, was presaged by a lot of things. I mean, there had been several conflicts with the Spanish already. There had been a terrible smallpox epidemic, which had just devastated the city, but then there had been the final siege of Cortez, which became so brutal that it was actually fought street by street throughout Tenochtitlan. I mean, it was really one of the most vicious battles in the Western Hemisphere that's actually ever been. I mean, when you actually look at how the fighting went, but the night before the fall of Tenochtitlan, it's reported by a number of people. It became part of Aztec kind of lore that, because they were sitting on a lake, and so there was a large, the city was built on a lake, so
Yeah.
there was a large part of the lake that was like open. You know what I mean? And so that night, that many people, like hundreds, maybe thousands of people saw this luminous cloud rise up from the lake, and it was kind of like this weird golden peach color. It rose up from the lake, and it turned colors. It turned like red and yellow and various colors. It wasn't like an object, or a defined light. It was more like a cloud, sort of a curtainy cloud sort of thing. And then it moved down towards the lake, and as it touched the lake, it dissipated. And that was interpreted by everyone who saw it, that the end had come.
Yeah.
And so when the armies, and apparently a lot of the soldiers, the remaining Aztec soldiers who saw it, just laid down their arms because they saw this, and they just thought that this is a sign that we need to stop. And the Spanish didn't quite get that. They didn't understand that this had been like this group experience that that maybe the majority of the remaining people in the city had seen. So that's like a really famous kind of image. But let's see, there was one other thing, and of course now I'm forgetting. because that to me is like a really poetic kind of thing. I think I know what the other thing was. What I did was I went ahead and sort of asked some of my friends around in the Hudson Valley, if they had been getting any more reports, or if there have been any more UFOs seen or anything like that. And what's interesting is that at least in this area, there hasn't been a great increase in that kind of activity. Although, to be honest, for a month, people have started going inside, so they may not have seen a lot of stuff outside. But what has been being reported by almost everyone is what we started out with: strange dreams, weird visitations. People telling me, I woke up and my father was sitting there in my bedroom. It's almost like people who have passed are trying to contact us, are trying to let us know something. And I think that has been the most striking thing that I have found, is people been having dreams, visitations, and not just weird feelings of anxiety, that's been part of it too, but just kind of like the sense that the whole planet is really kind of on an edge. And I don't mean, and that actually the truth is that we've been on this edge for a while, and this is revealing the edge that we're on.
Yes. Yeah. It's an invisible thing that's becoming visible, right? So yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to thank you for being here. I'm going to stop recording, but then we can talk in the background like people like to do.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.